Hey, you're listening to the Burnt Out Entrepreneur podcast, where you'll learn why you're feeling so burnt out, some insights and hacks to get you along this entrepreneurial journey. I'm Kylie Yota, former oil and gas manager turned health coach, life coach, and business mentor for female entrepreneurs just like you, and help them heal and recover from burnout. Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Burnt Out Entrepreneur podcast. Today, I'm here with Lara. She is a launch and systems strategist. And for those of you who follow me, she and I are connected through that world. And I just love launching. I love system strategy. And of course, I had to have her on my podcast. She supports entrepreneurs. And if you look at her page, go to her website and see all the people that she's worked with. So you know why I'm such a fangirl of her work. She supports entrepreneurs in creating profitable launches. Go look at her page and see how many profitable launches that she's been a part of. And she sees launches as a sustainable part of the coaching business. If we're not launching, if we're not selling things, then how do we even have a business? And I love the model that she teaches because she emphasizes values, leadership, and the system that she helps us coaches, entrepreneurs create. I love this, success beyond the card. A lot of times we focus on card itself, the numbers. And before we hopped on and started recording, we were just talking about numbers and how sometimes they are used in certain ways that may or may not serve the clients. And I love that she helps her clients really create these launch systems and uses it to enroll clients on repeat. And her style is really about building the values of integrity, growth, and love. So without further ado, welcome, Lara, to the podcast.
Thank you. And thank you for all of your kind words. I feel the feeling is very mutual. I think so highly of you. I'm really honored to be here today.
Oh, thank you. So the topic of today's episode is launch burnout. You and I have worked with a lot of different clients, helping them with launches and strategy. And we've seen our clients have launch burnout. And I know we've seen our clients' audience also have launch burnout. So one, let's talk about launching from a team perspective, because you and I have worked on those teams sometimes that's really around launch burnout. So what do you suggest us as coaches, if we are struggling with launch burnout? What would you say on how do we identify launch burnout? And then two, what are some steps that you take with your clients to help them not only identify launch burnout, but how to manage and mitigate that? Because we are in the middle of a launch, or it's either right, we're always in some kind of launch phase, pre-launch, launching, active launch, post-launch, looking at metrics, and gearing up for the next one.
Yeah.
How do we help our clients, or how do the coaches who are listening today identify the launch burnout and how to help them mitigate launch burnout in whatever phase of the launch cycle that they are in?
So, launch burnout looks similar to burnout in any other area of your life or your business. And I've gone through being on many teams and just my business. In life, I have 4 kids, I have 3 dogs, I live with my mom and my sister. So I've gone through burnout myself, and a lot of it, identifying it is really when you start to, the first kind of things that I notice is when I start to let go of some of the non-negotiables that I have, and I start to, and one of those huge things is self-care. So when I used to get a massage every single week, and I noticed at certain points in my business when I was getting busy and my clients were at higher expectations and more demands, I don't have time for that anymore. And I started to notice those things that filled me up, that helped my self-care and helped me show up as my best, were starting to fall by the wayside. And then I started to feel my energy. I was having trouble sleeping, I was having trouble getting up and out of bed in the morning. And I was going in to do things. I was feeling drained before I even started them. And started to experience breakdowns, right? Whether that was in my personal relationships, my kids and my husband, when I was getting burnout in my business, with team members, having shorter fuse when there's mistakes or there's a conflict, or you're not receiving something the way that maybe somebody intended. Mistakes, quote unquote mistakes, right? Maybe something goes out wrong or miss a detail that's really important. So those are some of the things that I start to notice. I'm going into burnout, and with my clients and the team members too, I start to notice. And then it's a slippery slope once you get in there. If you don't have the awareness, and once you have the awareness, if you don't start to take some action, it can progress and advance like there quickly, which I'm sure you can talk all about. But so that's how I would say to like the things that you can start looking for to identify launch burnout.
And I love how you said the non-negotiables, because right, this whole podcast is about how to prevent entrepreneur burnout. And a lot of times we see it with our clients, with our teams, when they start not having those non-negotiables on their calendar and like, I'm just busy, let me put that off. But when do we start saying yes to ourselves first? It's like I always preach, this as an entrepreneur is our greatest asset. If we're not taking care of our brains, then how are we going to come up with the ideas? How are we going to lead? How are we going to show up online? Because our brains direct our mouths. And if, say, we're in a summit and we're launching a summit, we're speaking every day. Like, I'm leading a podcast. How am I going to show up if my brain is not correctly connected to my mouth? If my brain is mushy and gushy because I'm not doing the self-care practices that lead to an expansive mind, a clear, coherent thought patterns and all of that. Like, how am I going to show up and be that powerful CEO that I need to be in my business? And how am I going to help mitigate issues with or amongst team members? It's like, okay, how can I have to be grounded? I have to be being a self-led leader. I'm like, okay, how do I show up in this space as a leader? And not to say that like we have to be superhuman and be like, I got it all straight
on all the time.
All the time. But how do we recognize those things that are like, oh, that's chomping at me? So we have those 4 signs: hungry, angry, lonely, tired. How do we then, can we recognize we are in one of those 4 halt symptoms? Then, of course, it'll say, okay, halt, what am I doing? And how do I get out of this mode? And what is contributing to me feeling this way right now? And like, okay, let me go fix it. And that's some of the things that I help my clients with when they are in burnout. It's like, okay, I see this is happening, or like, which one are you in? And then for both of us, we love setting up systems and how to create mitigating actions before it happens, or
be proactive.
And a lot of times, when I was talking to someone else about troubleshooting yesterday, where I came from in the oil and gas field, a lot of my job was troubleshooting. And that we built a whole incident investigation database. When an issue happened, we would write down all of the steps that led up to said incident. And then based on those circumstances, we would have mitigating actions to take to prevent another incident from occurring. And I was like, wow, I didn't realize that was going to be such a huge asset to helping my clients in their launch strategy. Because the other day I was helping someone in my church ministry. She's like there was a fire for her. And I was like, let me just ask these follow-up questions to get the answers. And I was helping to lead her, to help her find her own answers instead of always relying on us as leaders. And that's another part of leadership and launch burnout, is when we are taking it on, right? Say we are the launch strategist, we're the business coach, and we keep taking our clients' problems on, or the team members' problems on, and we become their savior, either as a coach or strategist. And they're so used to the coming to us.
And it's really disempowering to them, actually. And then it perpetuates that pattern. And instead of having a team that's empowered and can make decisions and use their own judgment for things, we're like taking that away from them. And one of the things that I feel like for coaches that they get burnout around is like decision fatigue, right? Of being the one that everybody goes to. When you start to empower your team, like I said, by asking those questions and get them to start thinking critically about the problems that are coming up, the breakdowns that are happening, the opportunity and the solutions, it takes some of that off of you and helps to relieve that that pressure. I love what you shared about troubleshooting. I read a leadership book last year. I don't remember the name, and this wasn't specific to this book, so it doesn't matter, but they were talking about the Toyota company, and the Toyota company had this framework when a problem would arise to ask why 5 times, 5 whys or something like that.
We use that. I use that in corporate too. Yes.
I love it. Like, I mean, I've done that in practice, but I didn't have a framework for it. And I love, when I read that, I was like, oh yes. And that it's so effective. I've been in launches where it's like, there's an immediate fire, there's an immediate problem that needs to be solved, and in the moment you're going to solve it, and sometimes you have to solve it and keep moving because other things are happening. But when you take the time to reflect and say, well, why didn't the email go out on time? Well, because it didn't get to the person in time. Well, why didn't it it didn't get to the person in time? Well, there was a breakdown between these 2 team members. But if you don't stop and go, well, why didn't it get to the person in time? Well, why didn't that person have what they needed to get it to them in time? Well, why didn't you start like peeling back those layers, you find the root cause, and that's how you solve problems, right? And stop them from continuing to happen, and help to alleviate the breakdowns, the burnout, and all of that stuff. So it's so worth the time to like dig a little bit deeper than just being on the surface.
So back to the 5 whys, when I was talking about the incident database, that was the process we used, was the 5 why process. And I love that because, and we can use it in our coaching businesses as well for, as coaches with our clients. I did say our client comes to us with a meltdown or a breakdown, personal, business, whatever. It's like, well, why did this happen? Okay, why did number 1 happen? Why did number 2 happen? And it really helps us with the self-reflection that we need to really analyze. It really helps to take us out of the blame game. Like that halt, right? The angry is usually the blame game, especially when we're dealing with teams and launches. It's like, well, why didn't this happen? Well, if we use the 5 why process, we can logically come to a conclusion that, well, and I think this is part of the launch burnout. It's like, well, we didn't have a big enough runway to actually pull off this launch without incidents. So maybe next time we're coming with an idea that's really close to the wire, maybe we will add another week to the launch date or something like that to mitigate those things. And I don't know, do you want to dive into sometimes when our clients come to us with these big ideas and they want to like put it out next week, and how do you help guide your clients through the thought process of like, well, okay, well, I know that this is what you would like to happen, but ideally we need an X amount of timeline to really do a good job on this.
I would love to speak into that. So I think I work with, and you probably have too, I don't know if your listeners are familiar with the Colby A assessment, but I work with a lot of quick starts, right? They're the ideas people, and they get ideas really quickly, and they get really excited about them, and in a very well-intentioned way, they want to get whatever it is they're creating into the hands of the people that it's going to help, right? And quite often they're like, I have this idea and I want it done yesterday. Right?
Yes.
And the fact is that I approach that from the perspective of setting expectations. So clients, I've had many clients over there say, well, we could do it. We could do it in a week. Like, yes, absolutely. We could do it in a week. But if we do it in a week, here's what we're sacrificing. We're sacrificing a very well thought out client experience that's going to support your client's journey and your conversions and your retention and your referrals, like not even in the short term, right? Looking longer down the line. We're going to sacrifice the team's bandwidth because they can only do so much in so little of time, and that's when breakdowns happen, when we're in this state of urgency and there's a lot of moving parts and everyone's trying to just scramble. There's breakdowns, there's mistakes that happens, there's miscommunications, and then also for the coach too, because a lot of coaches that I work, even the ones that are very well established, that have are high earning coaches, they are very often still writing their copy. They're still very involved in the messaging, and the ones that are going live on Facebook, or they're still need to show up. Right? they're putting themselves also in a position of burnout. That's like, well, you already have all these these coaching calls on your calendar for this week, and then how are we going to fit in the other things, that the sales calls or the right? So I always approach it from thinking about it from setting expectations, and also I always tie it back to how it's going to serve them. And and that is really really effective, because we can say all day like the team's going to feel burnout and the client experience, but like if we know what their goals are, if we know what our goals are, and we know what our intentions are, and we know what our values are, bringing it back to that, and like, how is this going to affect our ability to achieve the best possible outcome for this? And is it worth it to you to sacrifice that outcome because you want to get this done quickly? And very often we meet in a middle ground. Right? It's very rarely that a client's like, give you the 8-week runway that you want. And very often we meet in the middle. We find a common ground that meets everybody's needs, and then we move forward. And in cases where that's like a constant pattern, and it's like, okay, how do we interrupt this and like get ahead of the planning? Because that's the other thing. When you get in that pattern and you get behind on planning, it's a domino effect. Every marketing promotion after that is getting behind, and you're just stuck in this cycle, and then that's when the burnout happens, when it's the back to back to back to back, and you don't have the space.
And I know some of the things that I would do to get ahead of the planning is templates, system. Say we're launching, right? The webinar template is the same every time. The only thing that changes is the content. Recreate the wheel every time. To talk about this, we were talking about numbers before we started the podcast. Using your data, looking at what worked, what didn't work, and using that to inform your decision, so you have a shorter learning curve. And using that to make your decisions in your planning process, I think is really helpful. And going back to decision fatigue, when we're looking at the numbers and we're allowing the numbers to dictate what our next plan of action is going to be, that really helps with the decision fatigue. So a lot of times, so many opportunities, directions, well, I could do all of the things. And then that gets us into decision fatigue because we are weighing them out in our brains. But when we pull the data and we look at it on paper, okay, well, the data shows this, even though I feel, of course, I know there's a lot of coaches on here that lead more intuitively, and we can't knock that side of the people that help and support, because that is a lot of what makes them unique and what draws their client base to them, because they have all of that. But then that's why they need people like us to help round with the numbers, with the logistical pieces, and here's what all the different assets we need to create. Here's the normal timeline, and based on how these two team members interact, because we manage teams that are all over the globe, working in all different time zones.
Absolutely. And there's cultural differences and communication. There's a lot of different layers there. And I had a client who, this was in a launch I did last year. She runs a spiritual coaching business, and she did not look at her numbers. Just get very attached to the numbers, and you started talking numbers, she'd start to eyes would glaze over. And I remember one of the first meetings of the launch where we looked at the numbers, she was feeling a lot of self-doubt was coming up. She's like, things aren't working. We're not getting enough calls booked. We're not. And when I was able to go on our Monday meeting and I brought up the numbers, and she was like, everything's great. No, these are really good numbers. We're actually doing really well. Our conversions are really good. The call bookings that we're converting from our live events is right exactly where it should be or better. And she literally said, she goes, oh, this is where the numbers are supportive. Yes, it's affirming that what we're doing is working. So it's important to pull in both sides. It's important for things to feel good, but the numbers provide guidance that sometimes your intuition can't, right? It's both sides of the coin together.
I love it. Gosh, it's so fun today. Goodness. And based on some of the things that we're talking about, what are some of the things that you do in your business to help clients with their launches? And
I mean, in terms of burnout, number one thing is planning. And again, I personally work with a lot of spiritually led and intuitively led entrepreneurs. And they very often want to feel into things. Sometimes it takes them some time to feel into things. They want to be able to have time to download. Again, the ideas come in quickly. And I think some of the feedback that I've gotten from them is that like, they don't want to be like stuck in a plan, right? They don't want to be like nailed down to something. And what I always try to explain is that nothing is ever set in stone. A plan is a foundation. It's a foundation. It's dynamic, anything else, and it can change. And it actually provides you more flexibility and more agility when you have a plan. For example, I've had clients that when they first came to me, they were literally making decisions and promoting things and creating things like on a day by day or week by week basis with like absolutely no forward planning. There's no shame or anything here. We're all human. We all have our things that we get to work on, right? So when that's the pattern that you're in and the cadence that you're in, and your team, and a lot of this help manage teams, a lot of this for me always goes back to the team. When the team doesn't know what to expect, when the team isn't getting things in ahead of time, they can't have any proactivity. They can't be proactive. They can't have any forethought. And it creates a bunch of confusion. There's no clarity. Things are getting done haphazardly. They're getting done last minute. The breakdowns are happening, right? And so when something else changes, it's just another item of confusion thrown into the mix. When you have a plan, everyone's like, even at the basis sense where we know what the goals are, we know what the vision is, we know the big buckets of things that we're doing and how we're going to track it, how we're going to communicate, and what we're going to do as a team if breakdown happens. Those things as part of planning. When you have that foundation and all of a sudden you're like, gosh, I just had this inspiration to do this instead, or wow, this isn't working, like we need to pivot. It's so much easier to do that, and it's so much less confusing for your team, and it's so much more streamlined. So the plan is there to support you, and it can still change. So that's like the very first thing, is to get ahead of the planning. And I just wrote a really long email about this yesterday about having a planning system in your business and figuring out a planning cadence. So how far ahead are you planning? Having a planning team, so involving people in your planning decisions that have knowledge that you may not have, or recognize blind spots that you may not see. Having a system around communicating around your planning, and then having a planning software as well, some type of system for documenting your plans and like making sure things are on track. But planning is always the number one thing.
Yes, I love that. And I recently did a planning workshop, and I talked specifically to people who feel that way. And I said, planning is like scaffolding when you're building a building. I also said scaffolding, and then I also said Spanx. Plan is like Spanx that holds you in. And people resonated with that. It was hilarious. They're like, yes, Spanx.
I love it.
Because they could get the visual, because most of my clients are females, and it just holds you in. It just helps you to look better, helps your posture, helps you to feel more confident.
Yes.
It's not taking away from who you are. It just adds and makes you feel more confident. Enhancing. Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes. So the people who are listening and they're like, okay, well, I go back to what you said. The person who's like, well, I want to show up and I just launch. Here's what I see that's happening, like with some new clients that come in, and they're like, well, so-and-so is doing XYZ, so let me follow that pattern. But they're not seeing the behind the scenes and the planning that's taking place behind the scenes. They're like, oh, she's showing up like this, and she's launching something every whatever the interval is. I can do that too if I want to have that level of business. And it's like, wait a minute, look at the individual, look what kind of team structure do they have. do they have someone that is planning ahead strategically so that they can be the CEO, the visionary of their business, because they have someone planning out all of the other things in the background that is supporting them, that allows them to be that visionary piece.
Well, and the thing is, even when you see what you see on the surface, again, you don't see the structure and everything behind it, but honestly, sometimes there's not structure for those folks either. So some of them are, absolutely. Some of them are. Some of them aren't. And all we're seeing is the surface level. So it's really important to be discerning. And that's why when you're talking about in my bio, I always come back to like values. What are our values? What is important to us and our company? And that may mean that we're doing things completely differently than everybody else in our space is doing them. And that's okay. There's a lot of people that on the surface have really successful, high earning businesses. They've got large followings, and like, not knocking anybody, good for them, but their business may not be sustainable. Their business may not be profitable. You don't know that. We don't know that seeing it from the outside. And you don't see, maybe they have an amazing team that's supporting all this and they just show up live. Maybe not that that's all that they do, but I'm simplifying, but maybe they have built this business over like 20 years of experience of running other businesses and having the systems that support their business and having capital that supports their business. You don't see all of that. Maybe they're running Facebook ads and you don't have the resources to run Facebook ads. So comparing yourself to those folks and following kind of cookie cutter formulas and frameworks, really got to bring it back to grounding in with yourself, your team, your company. I had a client last year who signed up with a coach who's a very well-known specific launch formula, and she had other peers in her space that were having success with it. Again, on the surface, we don't know what was happening in the back end, and she was really excited. We ran the strategy, and at the end of it, she was completely burnt out. And when we debriefed, it was like, at the beginning of the year, we said our vision as a team was simplicity. And this strategy that we went ahead with was very complex. It was very complex. There was a lot of moving parts, and it did not align with our value as a company, as a team. And that was very evident in how the launch played out for us and how we all emerged from it. So I think it's, when you're thinking about your launch strategy, it's really, my client yesterday said, having too many cooks in the kitchen. Like, good to clear everybody out, get grounded in, have those trusted planning team members that are having some amount of input that complement what you, and approaching it from that perspective.
Where I worked at in oil and gas, we had 10 operating tenants, and one of them was get the right people involved. And that side of my life, there's so many launches they're not called launches in that world, but projects that we had that fell apart because the wrong people or the right people were not involved in making the core decisions. Say you have a copywriter that is going out of town. It's like, we can't necessarily launch at that time because the copy is not going to get written before, or they would have to arrange their schedule to get the copy written before they head out on vacation. But there's that long lead time that you need to kind of look at the systems, the people that are involved, and the nuances between team members, and like the whole picture, big picture vision.
And that's part of the planning. That's all part of the planning process.
And I think that's one of the things I see people struggle with when they're going from solo to having a team. Even if just one VA person, they're used to doing everything by themselves. And then they start hiring more team members, and then it kind of gets a jumbled mess because there's like a lot of moving pieces now that they have to be in charge of. And that's when they would hire someone to help with the launch strategy, because you're used to leading teams. You're used to seeing the big picture. You're used to seeing how all the pieces fit together, how the people fit together. And it really doesn't matter, because I know you've managed big teams, smaller teams, seeing what each person has to offer, how they fit into the big picture, and their capacity. And a lot of team members do different things. They're multi-talented, so can fill gaps and all that stuff. But that takes us as the strategist looking at that big overall picture, seeing the gaps, and how do we fill those gaps? And do we have people on the team that can fill those gaps? Or do we need to hire someone else to fill in those gaps? And it's a lot like corporate management, because you've been in corporate management, right? Leading teams there. It's pretty much the same thing as leading teams in entrepreneurship. It's just, it kind of feels more like a family vibe though, right? Versus corporate, where we're like, okay, well, I'm going home now. Going home now, you guys figure it out, or we'll come back tomorrow. But with the entrepreneurial teams, it's like Slack, Asana, whatever planning system uses there, and it feels more like a family vibe. So anyway, last but not least, the question I want to leave with today is, if there is someone listening to us talking about the planning, the teams, and all of that, and they're just feeling really overwhelmed. They're like, gosh, do I need all of that in order to live launch? And maybe that's what's missing from my business or whatever. What would be your words of advice for people who are feeling overwhelmed with live launching, and how they can mitigate those, well, not only the feelings, but the circumstances, all the issues that might come up with live launching?
Well, I mean, firstly,
big question, I know.
Loaded question. If someone's experiencing like launch burnout specifically, and they're like feeling overwhelmed by the process, because you'll see on your Instagram feed all these posts about, posts on Facebook for ditch live launching doesn't work, all this stuff. The fact is, live launching works. I mean, people wouldn't have been doing it for all these years if it wasn't an effective marketing strategy. I would say, and this kind of sounds counterintuitive for me to say as a launch strategist, don't rely on live launching. So don't just rely on live launching to support to be your source of traffic, to create your lead generation, and to create sales in your business. There's other complementary activities that you can be doing in your business to help support your growth without only relying on live launch strategies. So I'd suggest that people look at their business model and really think about it really intentionally, and how don't put all your eggs in one basket kind of thing, like how other things can fit together and complement each other. Secondly, I would say probably figure out what your issues are with live launching. Why does live launching not feel good to you? And when you asked me earlier, what's the first thing, and I said planning, after I was talking about it, I was like, actually, the first thing I would do is really figure out what is working with your live launching and what is not working with it. Yes. And I think it's really important to do an assessment. And this isn't just about numbers. So if you're not a numbers person, a lot of it is the experience. A lot of it is qualitative data, right? Not just quantitative side of things. So it is looking at are we using aligned strategies that are aligned to the resources that we have, to amount of revenue and capital that we have available to us, to what our team structure looking at, are we using aligned strategies? Do those strategies align to our values? And I feel like it all starts with that, because I think in the online space, where a lot of us have done it too, chasing what we see other people doing, and that leads to a lot of burnout too, because when we can't recreate the same results, even though we don't have the same resources, we don't have the same capacity, it starts to erode our confidence. Yeah. And then you have self-doubt, and then it's like, oh, I shouldn't keep live launching because it doesn't work for me. It can work for you. It does work. It's proven to work. Just to find a better way to do it that works for you.
And that's the main reason why I came up with the burnout archetypes, because there are 4 different personality types, and the way that you launch, the popular archetype is similar to the promoter archetype, right? So the promoter archetype could do a lot of Facebook lives and show up, because that's how they vibe, that's their energy. And I say perfectionist, which is related to the analyzer type. Maybe they're better at doing email launches, because they can analyze, they can correct, they can look at the copy, and they can And before it goes out, you can have as many
Mm-hmm.
editing and iterations as you want until you feel good and confident. And then you set out those emails, and that's how you launch. So there's like so many different, and that's why I love talking about the archetypes, because there are so many different ways to launch. In a nutshell, maybe let's define launch for people who are like, what is a launch? Because you and I live in the world.
Yes.
Basically putting your stuff out there, putting your offer out there.
I've been reflecting on this a lot, actually, because when I think about launching, for me, launching is marketing. It's getting your offers out there. When we think about like corporate worlds, a launch is when you're bringing a new product or a new service or a new offer to market. So it's in the online space, we've started to use it synonymously with marketing, right? So I think there's a lot of like charge around that. I've seen a couple other like experts in the space talking about how people are using the word launching incorrectly. Actually, I use it in the way I use it because that's what people associate. I mean, that's what people associate with. And also, live launching, when we're talking about live launching, for me is when you, more typically when you have like cohort-based group program or something that's starting like at a particular time, and you have a runway of time that you're like planning ahead and have multiple events that are leading into one another, taking everyone through a journey into like building the cohort-based program. So when I talk about live launching, that's what it means to me. But like, again, in the online space, I find people are using launching synonymously with their regular marketing activities.
And that's where I think it starts to feel heavy, and that's why people are like, I'm launching. If you're really using launching as synonymous with marketing, then you can never stop launching. Because if you're not marketing, you're not selling, then do you really have a business? How are you telling people about what you have to offer? How are you bringing new clients into your world if you're not talking about your offers? So yeah, if you're listening to this episode and you're like, launches are above me, I'm just here, I'm just starting. So in a nutshell, right? Launches are just putting your offers out into the world and letting people know that you have something to offer. So you can start small and just talking about your offers online and just keep doing that. But like how Lara said, the live launching that she's talking about and that we've been talking about today is really inviting people to join a program that starts with a cohort. So there's a start and stop. There is a whole launch cycle, but there's a pre-launch, getting people warmed up, nurturing them, and then getting people into your offer. And do you run sales calls, or do you just have a link and then they pay and then they join? And then you have the onboarding process. And there are a lot of moving parts to live launches, which is why it can feel heavy to live launch. But I'm telling you, it's everything that you build for a live launch, you still have to build for an evergreen model. The only main difference is evergreen is always there and it doesn't really change. But then that also gets stale, because when you do a live launch, is you can tweak your
there's a different energy. I listened to a podcast yesterday about passive revenue not really being passive. The way that a lot of coaches talk about passive revenue and passive products, like evergreen products, that it's passive. It's the same thing, like set it and forget it automation. You don't ever set and forget your automations. You need to be looking at your numbers and seeing what's working and where are people dropping off. And what I mean, the landscape of business is changing all the time. Your messaging needs to adjust. Sometimes I have clients that started out in business 5 years ago who have a completely different avatar now than they did then. So it is dynamic. It is all dynamic. And that's why I love what you were just sharing about the archetypes and like finding the way that works for you, because that helps to not have it feel draining. If you're doing a strategy that doesn't align with you or that's going to burn you out, of course you're not going to want to do it. And how's that going to affect your results? When you have a guide or archetypes quiz or something like that helps you to figure out what way aligns to you. You have a baseline and then you test and you tweak, you test and you tweak, you test and you tweak, right? That's what it's all about.
That's what it's all about. And gosh, today's conversation about launches is so good.
It was good.
We could probably talk for hours.
Yes. It's so fun. I mean, you and I could jam out on this stuff all day.
Yes. Well, for those who are listening and they're like, I'm not really up to speed, all the things you're talking about feel so overwhelming. I know you have a checklist for them that they could download so that all the things we're talking about today that may seem foreign, are in like super tight checklists for them to look at. Because I think the people who may feel overwhelmed by some of the things we're talking about today, they're actually doing some of these things in their business and they don't know that they're already doing it.
Absolutely. They definitely are. Even if you don't have a planning schedule ahead of time, you're planning in some way. Your lack of planning is a planning system. So in this, I do call it a checklist, but it feels like a lot more than a checklist. I mean, it really is a launch planning guide, and it really helps to break down those areas that really help you to understand what's that foundation. What's the vision for the launch? What are our goals? Are they realistic? And really map out things in a clear way so that you're clear, your team is clear, and you can have a more streamlined execution without all of the burnout, wondering what you're missing and all that kind of stuff.
That's the thing. The open loops in our brains really contribute to burnout, but seeing it in black and white, okay, do I have it? Do I not have it? I love a good checklist. My mom used to call me her little list maker. Because I make lists.
I love it.
Because for me, checking it off gives me that dopamine hit.
That's like that sense of accomplishment. Yeah. Even if you're a coach with one other person on your team, these kinds of things really support your implementers, because this is the way that their brain works, and then they can show up better in their role to support you. So again, you eliminate some of the decision fatigue. You don't feel like everything's relying on you. They have a guide to support them to execute and execute well.
Yes, I love that. And you're so good at helping people execute well. And if you want to learn more about her, you can find her on Instagram and Facebook. The links are in the show notes. And I highly advise that you get on her email list, because her emails are pretty fire as well. So go to her website. Links are all in the show notes. Get on her email list. Follow her on all the social media platforms, because what she spits is legit fire, and you're going to want to follow her.
Thank you. And I love your content too. We're so connected.
Yes. Thank you so much for being here today.
Oh, thank you, Kylie.
Oh, so fun. And yes, we'll probably have to record another episode.
Can't wait for it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.